Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we are diving straight into one of the absolute most staggering shifts in global power of our time. We're moving away from the familiar, coordinated Western financial institutions that have literally run the world for decades, and we're entering a completely new era, one defined by massive bilateral debt. The entire architecture of global trade is quietly being rewired right under our noses. And look, this isn't just about lines on a map. This rewiring affects global supply chains, inflation, and ultimately the prices of the goods you and I buy every single day. So to really understand how this is happening, we've got to look at the numbers.
All right, let's kick this off with a number. 99. 99 years. Just imagine handing over the keys to a vital piece of your country's infrastructure to a foreign power for a whole century. Well, that is exactly what a small island nation in the Indian Ocean did back in 2017. They had financed this massive deepwater port with billions in overseas loans, but the revenues, they just never met the projections. The debts became completely unpayable, and when those bills finally came due, a massive lease agreement was signed. Section 1, the 99-year port lease. Now, what's really critical to understand about this 99-year port lease in Sri Lanka is that this wasn't some military seizure. It wasn't an act of war in the traditional sense at all. It was a surrender of sovereignty driven entirely by a balance sheet. Sovereignty literally gave way to a commercial lease. And the lender that foreclosed on that port, well, it wasn't the IMF, it wasn't the World Bank, and it definitely wasn't Wall Street. It was China. And honestly, this single port is really just the tip of the iceberg of this massive shadow balance sheet that's stretching across the globe. Section 2. The post-WW2 Western Order. To truly grasp how radical this modern shift is, we have to take a quick look at the baseline we're leaving behind, right? For decades, the U.S. maintained a financial order that was firmly centered on multilateral institutions, specifically things like the IMF and the World Bank. Anchored by the U.S. dollar and that initial Marshall Plan financing, this aid was highly institutional and incredibly coordinated. It required sweeping governance reforms. That meant the money was inextricably tied to political transparency and multilateral oversight. It was an entire ecosystem built on nations working together under a unified Western-led framework. Section 3. China's bilateral debt machine. So here is where the massive global shift happens. We are moving away from that coordinated institutional Western aid straight into hard-edged bilateral debt. China's strategy relies on state policy banks directly funding physical infrastructure. And unlike the old Western model, this is fast money. It comes with way fewer political conditions, but it has these highly restrictive confidentiality clauses attached. It's a complete 180, from multilateral oversight to one-on-one bilateral leverage. It basically bypasses the old global committees entirely. And the sheer scale of this bilateral lending, it is absolutely staggering. Through the Belt and Road Initiative, which launched back in 2013, Beijing has emerged as the world's largest bilateral creditor in under 2 decades. We are talking about an estimated $1 trillion, maybe even more, pumped into over 140 countries. Just to put that into perspective, that completely dwarfs traditional development programs. We're talking about aggressively funding massive highways in Pakistan, vast railway networks in Kenya, and literally thousands of miles of fiber optic cables stretching all across Eurasia. But here's the real catch. A huge portion of this lending is effectively off the books. Research from institutions like AidData shows us that this hidden debt doesn't even appear in official World Bank or IMF databases. Instead, it gets routed through special purpose vehicles or state-owned enterprises. And this brilliantly and honestly somewhat terrifyingly obscures a borrowing country's true fiscal exposure. In some documented cases, local parliaments aren't even fully aware of the financial terms until the ink on the contract is already dry. No way, right? But it happens. Section 4. Anatomy of a Chinese loan. Let's break down exactly how this works in practice, because the mechanics are super fascinating. Step 1, a developing country identifies a need. Say they want a brand new railway. Step 2, Chinese state-owned enterprises swoop right in and offer to design and build the whole thing. Step 3, Chinese lenders step up to arrange the financing. It is a completely closed-loop system. These loans often sit at near-market rates, which are actually higher than traditional development bank loans, and they mandate the use of Chinese contractors, Chinese equipment, and sometimes even Chinese labor. So the money barely even leaves the ecosystem, yet the developing nation is entirely on the hook, backing the loan with sovereign guarantees or local commodity revenues. Plus, these contracts come packed with some pretty aggressive financial engineering. A really common, highly secretive feature is called a cross-default provision. In simple terms, it means this. If a borrowing country defaults on just one Chinese loan, Beijing can instantly call in all their other loans. Boom, just like that. This creates a tightly interconnected web of financial pressure and effectively gives Chinese lenders VIP priority status over any other global creditors. So make no mistake about it, this is not charity. It's highly structured, strictly collateralized debt. So what happens when a country inevitably hits a wall and struggles to pay? Well, under the old Western order, defaults are handled by the Paris Club. That's a bunch of creditor nations sitting around a table coordinating debt relief together in a relatively transparent way. But under the new Chinese order, negotiations are strictly bilateral. That ensures a distressed developing nation has to walk into the room completely alone to bargain against a trillion-dollar financial giant, and that drastically maximizes Beijing's leverage to ask for strategic concessions. And all of this brings us to a fiercely debated question in places like Washington, London, and Berlin. Is this a deliberate debt trap perfectly designed to gobble up global assets? Or is it just a high-risk development strategy colliding with a super volatile global economy? Well, when you look objectively at the data, the reality is a lot more nuanced. Actually, the whole evil master plan narrative kind of oversimplifies things. Developing nations aren't just passive victims here. They actively and willingly seek out these loans for fast, red tape-free growth. Meanwhile, China itself is taking on unprecedented financial strain and massive default risk as global interest rates rise. Defaults usually involve complex global shocks combined with domestic mismanagement. And hey, it isn't a one-way street. We've actually seen sovereign nations like Malaysia and Pakistan successfully push back at the negotiating table to restructure deals that simply weren't working for them. Section 5. Why debt equals power. Now, even when these massive projects totally underperform financially or face extreme construction delays, they still often succeed strategically. Think about it. Financing the physical backbone of a nation translates directly into an embedded physical presence. If you manage the ports, you see and influence global trade flows. Plus, a lot of this is dual-use infrastructure. A commercial port built for cargo containers can very easily be adapted to refuel naval vessels. That extends military reach without the intense, messy geopolitical optics of building an official military base. Ultimately, this economic dependence softens political resistance, and it even leads to shifting voting patterns at the United Nations in favor of the creditor. History actually gives us a really clear blueprint here. Whoever finances the roads, the rails, and the sea lanes of commerce inevitably shapes the century that follows. In the 1800s, Britain did it with sprawling merchant fleets and sterling credit. In the 1900s, America did it with the sheer power of the dollar and multilateral development banks. And today, in the 21st century, China is attempting to weave its own distinct web, utilizing state policy banks and trillion-dollar bilateral infrastructure lending to establish a brand new normal. So as global economic gravity fundamentally shifts along these newly financed infrastructure corridors, we have to ask ourselves a pretty big question. Is the ultimate measure of geopolitical power no longer the size of a nation's military, but rather the size of the debt it holds? In the modern era, the largest shadow is cast not by armies, but by creditors. Let that sink in for a minute. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep questioning the structures that shape our world.